I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you news from the front lines as Ukrainian troops withdraw from a key district of Chasiv Yar. And we have the latest diplomatic and political news as President Zelensky challenges Donald Trump to explain his peace plan.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 4th of July. 2 years and 136 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls and assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Let's start in the east of Ukraine, the Donetsk region and the city of Chasiv Yar, which has been under relentless attack for weeks now. Ukraine's troops are said to have pulled out of a key district in the city, so Ukrainian armed forces said this morning. Now, this city, Chasiv Yar, is said to hold the key to the rest of the Donbass. It's supposed to be the sort of gateway to a sort of line of four major cities which command the ground in the area. Been under attack for months now, land and air. Military spokesperson Nazar Voloshin, speaking on national TV, said it became impractical to hold the canal neighbourhood after the enemy entered it. The positions of our defenders were destroyed. The command decided to pull back to more protected and prepared positions, but even there, the enemy does not stop its active combat actions. Now, the wider area still seems to be engulfed in intense fighting. Ivan Petrachuk, spokesperson for Ukraine's 24th Brigade, defending Chasiv Yar, said, "We see no let-up in the amount of shelling. The enemy is using artillery and multiple rocket systems. The situation remains tense, but the 24th Brigade is holding its positions." Now, Mr. Petrachuk said this situation was critically difficult, fierce fighting around the canal area. So just to dial ourselves into the geography, so Chasiv Yar, a city of about, picture it as a capital F, the lesser capital F, but with the uppermost bar, the horizontal bar, longer than the lower one, about each side about 2 k's long-ish. Now, imagine that the end of the top line of that capital F, the last quarter of it, is bisected by a canal running north to south. That forms a natural obstacle, that canal. It's very hard to get across. It's somewhat easier to defend, not impossible. And I think interpreting those statements, I've had a look at the ground, I think what Ukraine has done is pulled its forces back across that canal into the wider bit of that capital F and left that last sort of 20%, if you like, or 10% of the whole city on the eastern side of the canal in Russian hands. That's what I think is happening, but that's not been confirmed anywhere. Now, elsewhere, and last night, Ukraine shot down 21 of 22 Shahed drones that had been fired at 6 regions across northern and central Ukraine. This comes from Ukraine's Air Force this morning. The governor of the northern region of Chernihiv said that one of the drones struck a facility in his region that's left over 5,000 people without power. That was part of a range of attacks across the country. Zaporizhzhia regional governor Ivan Fedorov said 10 settlements in his area had been hit a total of nearly 400 times in the last 24 hours, causing deaths and injuries across the region. There was a wave of air attacks on Dnipro city, which killed more people. President Zelensky, in his nightly address yesterday, issued a fresh appeal for more air defense systems and for permission to use Western-donated weapons to strike Russian targets inside Russia. He said, as of now, 5 people have been killed and 34 injured, including a child. Only 2 things can stop this Russian terror: modern air defense systems and the long-range capabilities of our weapons. Now, separately, Russia's defense ministry has said this morning that its troops had destroyed a Ukrainian MiG-29 fighter jet during what is, if it's true, and we've no way of verifying any of this, verifying the Ukrainian assertions either, but if this is correct, then it's the second strike in a week on air bases deep within Ukraine. So Moscow claimed the jet, or that a jet, vehicles and other equipment had been destroyed at the base of Dolgintsevo by an Iskander ballistic missile attack. They've posted footage, which we're carrying on our website for you to have a look at. I'm going to have a look at it. It's interesting. I've been looking at it again and again, trying to look at different angles, trying to find more information on it. It does show an aircraft, but it certainly ain't a MiG-29. But it shows an aircraft near, it's very it'd be very generous to call it a hardened aircraft shelter. So you hear about the term HAZs, hardened aircraft shelters, which do exactly what it says on the tin. That's how you should look after your aircraft. Well, the thing that this aircraft is parked next to certainly isn't one of those, or not to any great degree. And then the shot sort of changes angle, and we see an area explode, but whatever the structure is not hit. I mean, the missile lands nearby, so I don't think any person would have survived if they'd been stood nearby, but it certainly didn't hit the structure. And in that second image where something explodes, I can't see that aircraft that's in the first one that I'm saying wasn't a MiG-29 anyway. So there's a lot of differing images there, I think. There's no battle damage assessment. There's no BDA. So, for example, we're not shown, if there's a Russian drone in the area that's showing this area and purporting to show this attack, it doesn't hang around afterwards and show us anything afterwards, a smoking MiG-29 hulk on the floor. So it's all a bit of a mishmash. I can't say for certain whether it did or didn't happen, but go and have a look for yourself. I'm skeptical, I will say. However, you'll remember that on Tuesday, Russia said it had destroyed 5 Ukrainian Su-27 jets and damaged 2 more at another airbase deep inside Ukraine in Migorod. Now, that attack, not the numbers necessarily, but the attack was confirmed by Ukraine at the time. And this is all thought to be part of Russia's effort at the moment to target airfields they believe will eventually house F-16s when they turn up. Okay, the next one. Interesting story from Bloomberg. Bloomberg is saying that Russia and China are working together to produce a version of Iran's Shahed drone. They are quoting European intelligence sources for their piece. Now, they're saying that the drones themselves are still described as being in the test and development phase, but any sending of drones from China would be a major escalation in their support for the Kremlin. Now, one source told Bloomberg that the US still doesn't consider China to be sending lethal aid, but conceded that other nations may have a different interpretation. It's all military. It all has military use. Russia, obviously, largely reliant on Iran for drones up to now, certainly in the quantities it requires. It can make its own drones to a certain degree, but nothing like the quantity that they've been receiving Shahed drones. And we know that Russia, it's strongly suspected that Russia's building a factory in the city of Kazan, 600 k's east of Moscow, specifically to produce their own version of drones. But at the moment, very, very heavily reliant on importing this kind of stuff. Now, Western officials declined to give specifics on this alleged China drone program, but Bloomberg reported that Chinese factories are developing a drone that's been dubbed the Sunflower 200, very similar in appearance to the Iranian Shahed. I'm not exactly sure who has dubbed it the Sunflower, obviously a national symbol of Ukraine, but it's a rather pointed reference. China and Russia, of course, increasingly close. I think we're going to hear more about that shortly from Francis. So I reckon this is probably more push from Moscow than pull from Beijing. But China is thought now to be doing more than just sending small tokens of military equipment. For example, it's been said that they are providing satellite imagery of battlefield in Ukraine. So they seem to be getting more involved. And you may remember Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, last month accused China of keeping the Russian defense industrial base going. He said they were providing 70% of the machine tools that Russia's using and 90% of its microelectronics. Russia, for their part, selling most of its oil and gas to China at a heavily discounted price to keep that trade going. And Chinese banks also provide critical infrastructure for Russia's financial institutions, trading rubles for renminbi, the yuan, the Chinese currency. On Wednesday of this week, the head of Russia's civil nuclear power program said he was going to fly to China in the next few days to start a joint project to build a nuclear power station on the moon by 2036. So, okay, maybe take that one a bit of moon dust, but very, very much closer ties between the two countries. Okay, a couple more from me. Ukraine sought to address its manpower issues by forming several new brigades, but weapon shortages and delays mean they're not at all likely to be equipped as such. This comes from the ISW, Institute for the Study of War. The US-based think tank says that timely and appropriate Western security assistance continues to be a critical determinant of when and at what scale Ukrainian forces can contest the battlefield initiative and conduct operationally significant counteroffensive operations in the future. Now, comes, as President Zelensky said yesterday, that Ukraine's forces are in a much better place in terms of manpower than they were a few months ago. However, speaking to Bloomberg, he said no counteroffensive would be able to take place without equipping brigades with heavy equipment, IFVs, so the infantry fighting vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, tanks and other stuff like heavy artillery. A bit more NATO aid on the way. NATO officials have agreed to provide Kyiv with an additional 40 billion euro, so about 34 billion quid, about 42 billion US dollars worth of military aid next year. This comes from a Western diplomat. Leaders are expected to sign off on this pledge at the NATO summit next week in Washington. Ukraine expected to be very, very high on the agenda, if not dominating the whole week. The outgoing Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has asked allies to make a multi-year commitment to keep funding Kyiv at the same level that they have done since the full-scale invasion a couple of years ago. So that's roughly 40 billion euro a year. Jens Stoltenberg saying that we need to make a commitment, a long-term commitment at that sort of level. The quantity of money is good, but of course it's the being able to plan year after year to then lay down these long-term industrial contracts. That's what's really going to tip the scales in an attritional industrial war, which is seemingly where we are at the moment. So let's keep an eye out for that next week in Washington. And then just finally for me, David, a couple are said to have posed as newlyweds to send pictures of Ukrainian targets back to Russia. Ukrainian authorities have detained a couple who have been posing in front of certain locations, masquerading as newlyweds. This comes from the SBU, the Ukraine Security Service. They said that a 23-year-old man and his 18-year-old female partner, both from the Odessa region, were collecting intelligence for Moscow on important sites that are targeting for future airstrikes. The SBU said that the pair were caught red-handed and detained when, quote, spying near a potential target. The agency said they've uncovered anti-Ukrainian leaflets and evidence of payment from the FSB, that's Russia's security service. So the insider threat's still very, very real there. And that's us up to date, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of that. Francis, can I come to you? What's the latest diplomatic and political news?
Well, thanks, David, and happy Independence Day to our American listeners. Just think, in a different world, you could still be living under the prosperous rule of King Charles III. Lord North has a lot to answer for. But with that thought, let's start with the US again, shall we? The increased conversations about the prospect of a return of President Trump, discussed at length in yesterday's podcast and the day before, has sparked an interesting intervention by President Zelensky. So he has openly called on Donald Trump to disclose his plan to end the war in Ukraine and warned that any proposal must avoid violating Ukraine's sovereignty. To quote President Zelensky directly, if Trump knows how to end this war, he should tell us today. Because if there are risks to Ukraine's independence, if there are risks that we lose statehood, we want to be prepared for this, he told Bloomberg. They can't plan my life and life of our people and our children. We want to understand whether in November we will have the powerful support of the US or we will be all alone. Now, I think this gets to the heart of something underappreciated by many Western politicians and commentators, that Ukraine remains publicly, at least, committed to fighting to restore all of its territory for as long as that struggle takes. I've seen no evidence that they are expecting or eagerly awaiting negotiations to begin where they would be willing to concede territory. That has major ramifications for the war as a whole, but it's rarely discussed as far as I can tell. We've mentioned it a few times on the podcast over the last couple of years, this gap, but it doesn't seem to really be something that is articulated publicly by many politicians, even those who are friendly to Ukraine. But it really is vital, and it gets to the very core of where we might go in the so-called worst-case scenarios from Ukraine's perspective, where let's imagine that America does withdraw substantial support, then it will be up to Europe to fill that void potentially if Ukraine does not decide to try and get to the negotiating table as soon as possible, if indeed that is what a President Trump wants. So an interesting intervention, I think, by Zelensky, and pretty punchy, given that we know he is in conversations with Trump's team. As I say, for more on this, I recommend yesterday's episode where I talked about a Politico article reflecting on the most likely attitude that Trump will adopt towards Ukraine, though, of course, always emphasising that at the moment it is speculation. And as we all know, Trump is very much a changeable figure, and he may not even win the presidency. But the point is, we have to imagine that scenario, given how many polls at the moment suggest it is the most likely scenario. Now, staying with Zelensky, according to reports in Ukrainska Pravda, he may be preparing to sack Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal in a major possible shake-up to his cabinet. Officials close to Zelensky said the president is looking for more creative leadership and is finding Shmyhal, who's been in post since 2020, slow to adapt. He doesn't even listen to him much anymore, says one source. It's more of an emotional thing than a miscalculation. A second source added it was the second attempt by the administration to dismiss Mr. Shmyhal in 2 months, and that he's likely to be replaced with the first deputy prime minister, Yulia Svyadenko. Now, the usual caveats apply. This could be politicians playing politics, but nonetheless, it is interesting and might be significant. After all, I do find that wording there about wanting creative leadership quite revealing. We've talked about in the past the challenges the administration faces of still saying the same messaging 2 years into the war and getting the same amount of exposure for doing so. There needs to be, arguably for some time, really a change in strategy, at least in terms of public articulation, even if their own stance does not change, in order to keep the spotlight. And that's just a fact, however uncomfortable it may make us. Now, turning away to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Kazakhstan, which is that meeting attended by President Putin. There have been some interesting remarks that have come out of it. I gave a little bit more context on this yesterday and those that are present. Now, one of the other attendees is President Erdogan of Turkey, who told Putin he can play peacemaker between Russia and Ukraine to end the war, fulfilling that long-established role Turkey has had as a historical broker between East and West. So he said a just peace that suits both sides is possible. As I mentioned a moment ago, this, to me at least, seems to misunderstand how irreconcilable the two sides' perspectives of the war are. Neither Russia nor Ukraine have or will really abandon their maximalist objectives until they are compelled to do so by external forces or on the battlefield. As things stand, there's no peace that can suit both sides, nor can we really ever envisage one, I don't think. One side or the other will not succeed in their overarching objective. It can't be any other way. And the battle is about which side succeeds in its objective and which side loses its objective. So all of this talk, I think, is for the birds until something fundamentally changes. But we've been saying that now for the best part of a year and a half. But nothing fundamental has yet changed, one could argue. Now, meanwhile, further to what Dom was talking about earlier on in the weapons realm, China and Russia have also urged at this summit their allies and partners to advance their shared agenda. Xi of China called on countries to resist external interference, whilst Putin claimed new centres of political and economic might were on the rise. But to quote the Xi quotation in full, he said, "We should join hands to resist external interference," which is pretty ironic given that they are the ones pushing this Belt and Road initiative. But anyway, that's by the by. Firmly support each other, take care of each other's concerns, and firmly control the future and destiny of our countries and regional peace development in our own hands. It is of vital importance to the world that this summit be on the right side of history and on the side of fairness and justice. Anyway, so an interesting one. No huge surprises there, nor any major announcements as yet. But further signs of how, despite the initial shock of the war and the prospect of Putin not being able to travel, he is now back on the diplomatic circuit. Though it would be interesting to know how those countries feel privately about him cozying up to Kim Jong-un in North Korea and whether their perspective on Russian power projection has changed. There is considerable evidence that it's quite profoundly changed in Central Asia. And we've discussed that, of course, with James Kilner many times, and I believe he'll be joining us on the podcast tomorrow. So those are the major stories in the political realm, David. Conscious that a few of those are continuing from yesterday and earlier episodes this week, but that's how things are at the moment, that things in the political realm are going quite steadily as we await the NATO summit and, of course, the conclusion of this summit in Kazakhstan.
Thank you very much, Dom and Francis. One hopefully very interesting update for our listeners. To add more value to Telegraph subscribers, we've launched bonus episodes on Apple. So just on Apple Podcasts at the moment. You might have seen, if you do listen on Apple, you'd have seen the first episode on Battle Lines, our sister podcast, and of course on Ukraine, the latest. They're published this week, published yesterday. If you are a subscriber, or you want to be a subscriber, you can link your Telegraph subscription with your Apple Podcasts, and that gets you access to these new shows. You'll get early access to them and ad-free listening. These episodes that we're launching, they will be published for everybody in a couple of weeks, but we want to give subscribers to the Telegraph a sort of a few weeks head start, part of the added value of being a Telegraph subscriber. So the very first of those episodes, we published one yesterday on the Ukraine feed, and we published one on the Battle Lines feed. The Battle Lines episode is actually our very own Dom Nicholls talking to former Royal Navy sailors about how to hunt a Russian submarine. And the Ukraine episode is a mini documentary, really, of my time going back to Hostomel and Bucha in our trip earlier this year. So if you are, or you would like to be a Telegraph subscriber, do link up your subscription with Apple Podcasts, and you can listen to those episodes ad-free today. And if you don't want to, that's of course completely fine, but you'll get those episodes in a couple of weeks when they go on the wider feed for everybody to listen to. Can I come to Dom first for your very final thought, please? Dom Nicholls.
Yeah, thanks, David. That interview about how to hunt a Russian submarine, I interviewed Ryan Ramsey, who's a former submarine commander, and he was sort of talking about what the fight looks like below the surface. I also spoke to friend Tom Sharp. So the two of them were having a bat and ball, basically, about who could do it better, but actually then they both came to the conclusion that they neither could do it without the other. So, but it's a fascinating sort of a peek below the waves about how to hunt submarines. So do go and have a listen to that if you, well, as David says, if you so wish. And if you don't want to, that's fine as well, which is nice to know. Anyway, final thought. I would point you towards my friend and colleague Rohit at ITV, Rohit Khatru. He's the global security editor at ITV here in the UK. He's done had an interview with Sir Alex Younger, the former chief of SIS, better known as MI6. Good interview. He's got it out on social media at the moment. Just on the ITV website. Alex Younger says that he's worried about Donald Trump returning to office in the US elections in November. Alex Younger said, "What's the thing that we do that autocratic regimes don't do? We make alliances, and we have a separation of powers within our countries that make our governments accountable. I think on both those issues, Donald Trump takes a different approach." Alex Younger also said that Donald Trump was right to bully, his words, bully many NATO nations to do more, over the spending, and says that he totally acknowledges that many NATO nations were free riding, again his words, free riding on the US. Alex Younger said, "My message to Donald Trump, if I was the next prime minister, would be that America is not being done over. It's a prime beneficiary of the international system that it has set up and its willingness to police globalization. Whilst I can see that is an onerous and expensive task, it's profoundly beneficial." And then just finally, he was pointing out the threat from Russia. He says, we have 10 years to sort ourselves out on this and face down, as sees it, the Russian threat. He says, if we don't do it in 10 years, I think we're going to put our kids in a position of extraordinary vulnerability for which they will not thank us. So that was a sort of snapshot of about a 5 or 6 minute televised interview with Sir Alex Younger, former head of MI6, by Rohit, my pal Rohit over at ITV. So well worth a look. Interesting comments there from former spook.
Thank you very much, Dom Nicholls. Francis Dearnley, would you like the very final words today?
Thanks, David. I mentioned earlier that it's Independence Day in the United States today. And of course, it is also the day of the general election here in Britain, which we will discuss the results of tomorrow. Due to election restrictions here, we can't go into detail whilst elections are taking place, just the way things stand, but we will be doing so tomorrow. But suffice to say, it's on days such as this that there is a value, I think, in pausing to reflect on the privilege that is political sovereignty and democracy, something that is being fought for in Ukraine, of course, and many other countries across the globe. Freedom isn't free, as we often hear, and we forget that at our peril. The solemnity of the ballot box, as you're scribbling your cross, is something that was earned on a crowded, loud, horrific battlefield in many circumstances. And so when you have the right to vote, it's something that was not shared by those who gave their lives in order to make yours possible. So a bit of a somber final thought, David, but it's something I'll be thinking about when I go and vote later on.
And just before we go, here's a short extract from the subscriber first audio documentary we released yesterday on Wednesday. For 2 months, Roman wasn't able to return to his apartment. From Kyiv, he could see smoke in the sky from the direction of Hostomel, but he had no way of knowing whether his flat was still standing. By the end of March, the Russians were in retreat, but Roman was only able to come back 2 weeks later. The area had to be demined, and when he returned, there was no electricity, no water, no sewage system.
Тут у дворі стояла їх техніка. В будинку вони влаштували собі базу. Ось тут прям тут вона стояла.
Roman showing us a video now of their re-entry into this where we're standing. So this playground just in front of, just in the middle of all these apartments, and the ground is all churned up. There's lots of damage to the apartments, and he's saying that the Russians in the occupation placed a lot of their heavy vehicles here. That's something I've seen quite a bit. And in fact, that's a mini shell splatter, isn't it? There's quite a lot. The damage is radiating outwards, and you can see where it's going.
Absolutely, some sort of artillery.
Це те, що
The Roman's showing us pictures of one of his neighbour's flats, and it's completely blown out. There's no glass in the windows, and there's rubble everywhere. So was it hit by a missile or a
Mortar. It was a mortar, yeah.
власне постріляні машини, хто залишав. Тобто картина виглядала трошки.
So Roman is saying that they chose this building to be their headquarters.
The apartment block is many stories high and overlooks the whole city of Hostomel. Because of its strategic position, Roman tells us the Russians used the flats as an observation point. They even occupied his flat. And if you want to hear more of Roman and his family's story, do go to our subscriber-only audio on our subscriber feed, on our Apple podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear.